All right, welcome back. This is Unit 5, Video 3, and we are finishing out Unit 5 with the struggle for ratification. So, on September 17th, 1787, Washington offered the final draft of the new charter to the convention. After the delegates signed and sent it to the Confederation Congress, the document would pass to the states for their consent, aka ratification. So, the definition of ratification is to approve or consent of something. So, although many of the delegates supported the final document, Edmund Randolph and George Mason of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts objected to the expanded powers of the national government and the absence of a Bill of Rights. Mason adamantly declared that he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution because of the document's failure to guarantee civil liberties. Such objections foreshadowed a difficult ratification process that ultimately proved successful. The approval of at least 9 states was required by Article 7 of the Constitution. However, the reality is that they needed all 13 to sign off on it. Because, for instance, if 9 states did it and they weren't New York, Virginia, or Pennsylvania, which are all the big states that you have to travel through to get to all the other states at that time, in reality, this would not function well. So they knew they needed all 13, but at least 9 to get started. After the signing and celebration supper, the delegates parted company. Their work would now be scrutinized by the nation. The greatest hurdles lay before them. The Constitution makers had put forth a remarkable effort, but privately, some of them worried about ratification because the stakes were so high. I mean, seriously, if it didn't pass, what would happen next? Washington wrote Edmund Randolph saying, "This, or a dissolution, or like dissolving, of the Union, awaits our choice." He also wrote his fellow delegates, advising them that the event is in the hand of God. They could do no more with it. It was up to God now. So, 2 days after the delegates went home, the text of the Constitution was published in the Pennsylvania Packet of Philadelphia. For the first time, Americans learned what had been devised behind the closed doors of the Pennsylvania State House. And not everyone was pleased. Battle lines were drawn pretty much overnight. You had supporters of the Constitution, called Federalists, and those who opposed it, who were called Anti-Federalists. Just 1 week after the proposed Constitution was published, a New York newspaper denounced the Constitution in an article penned under a pseudonym, Cato. Cato was, in fact, actually, the New York Governor George Clinton, who was soon joined by uh, Sidney and Brutus and others in a series of anti-federalist articles. So Cato, Sidney, and Brutus, they are referencing um, leadership in the Roman Empire, right? And that were directly related to Julius Caesar. So the people in New York, not a fan, except for Alexander Hamilton, the lone New York delegate who had supported this and signed the Constitution, returned home to find political winds blowing against the Constitution. Before I go any further, let me just pause and tell you a little bit about this painting. This painting of the signing of the Constitution was created by Howard Chandler Christie. This is a picture of him, and he completed it in 1940. Now, what's amazing about this painting is it's probably as accurate as we can get. He spent 2 years researching where people sat, what they look like, and like every aspect of the Constitutional Convention before he started painting it. And then it took him 8 months to paint this. Now, that is dedication. When was the last time you worked on a project for 3 years? Think about that. Now, each one of their faces is based on the likenesses that we know of the men, the pictures we have, the paint, not pictures, but paintings we have and sculptures. Now, you'll also notice that some faces cannot be seen, and that's because we literally have no idea what they looked like. And so he purposefully did not take artistic license and create a face that he wanted. He just left them turned to the side or blocked by an arm so that it would be as accurate as possible. We don't know what those men look like. So, this is probably the best painting we have of the signing of the Constitution by Howard Chandler Christie. It took 2 months of research, 8 months to complete, and it was completed in 1940. And it's one of the most famous pictures from the colonial era. So here's our two sides, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. We need 9 out of the 13. I'm going to stay right here and continue to give you some information, and then I'm just going to go through the slides so that you can see the two sides, like what the Federalists thought of something and what the Anti-Federalists thought of something. So we were left off before the painting explanation. We left off with Alexander Hamilton in New York, and the Anti-Federalists were the first to publish things about the Constitution in the newspapers. And so Alexander Hamilton is going to respond to the Anti-Federalist articles by writing some Federalist articles under the pen name Publius. Hamilton also enlisted the help of James Madison and John Jay. And then a war of words commenced. Together, the trio wrote 85 essays that were widely read throughout the country. These essays would eventually be compiled into 2 volumes and be published under the name The Federalist or The Federalist Papers in 1788. We have read excerpts from the Federalist Papers. So this work is meant to answer all the Anti-Federalist objections by carefully explaining and forcefully defending constitutional provisions of power. It also predicted dangers and dismemberment of the nation if the Constitution was rejected. So the Federalist was to ratification what common sense was to the Revolution. It was a persuasive force, particularly in those states where ratification hung in the balance. And the top 2 states where it was intense were New York and Virginia. The Federalist Papers, it's also a very comprehensive commentary on Republican government and how it works. Jefferson praised it as the best commentary on the principles of government which had ever been written. Historian Clinton Rossiter perhaps best explained the universality of the Federalists when he wrote this that the essays are, and this is a quote, now valued not merely as a clever defense of a particular charter, but as an exposition of certain timeless truths about constitutional government. The message of the Federalist Papers reads, no happiness without liberty, no liberty without self-government, no self-government without constitutionalism, no constitutionalism without morality, and none of these great goods without stability and order. Now, that's the side we know a lot about. They were well published. Less well known are the Anti-Federalist Papers, the collected writings and speeches by opponents of the new Constitution. They were the response of the Anti-Federalists to the publication of the Federalists. So the Anti-Federalists were not radicals who were against free government or constitutional liberties. They included patriots like Patrick Henry, Edmund Randolph, James Monroe, George Mason, George Clinton. In addition to Cato, Sidney, and Brutus, the Anti-Federalists wrote under a pseudonym such as Sentinel or the Federal Farmer. So each state kind of had a battle for what was going to happen. And like I said, New York and Virginia were the most tested. James Madison definitely took the Federalist head in Virginia, and Alexander Hamilton kind of took the Federalist lead in New York. Delaware led the states by giving the Constitution its unanimous consent on December 7th, 1787. And then within a month, four more states joined: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. They ratified the Constitution. Then you had Massachusetts. Yet again, Massachusetts is also going to be a big battle. The Anti-Federalists were more organized and they had leaders with considerable stature in these states, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York. So Massachusetts approved the Constitution in a close vote. Um, and then it was down to the last two. And they knew if New York failed to ratify, then New England would be cut off geographically from the rest of the country. And if Virginia refused to join, then the South would be severed. So the Anti-Federalists of Virginia were led by the fiery orator Patrick Henry and the non-signing conventional delegates, George Mason, Governor Edmund Randolph. Um, but eventually, the Virginia Federalists would win by a very narrow margin of 89 to 79. And then at the Virginia Convention, Madison also had a concession to make that victory happen. The tiebreaker in Virginia and the catalyst for the final battle for New York was that he conceded that he would write a Bill of Rights and have it added as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And that was what helped the Anti-Federalists sign off on everything. So the office of the chief executive was one of the most significant and least controversial departures from the old Confederation government. George Washington, who is first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen, was the natural choice for the highest office. And on February 4th, 1789, Washington was unanimously elected president by the Electoral College. And he became the first president of the United States. There's one last thing that I want you to know kind of about the Bill of Rights and how oftentimes it's the people unsung in history, the small and the mighty, that make a big difference to our country and the way it functions. So let me tell you a little bit about some pastors who had a big part in the Bill of Rights. Many Protestants, including Baptists, supported the war for independence. One reason for their support was the anticipation of religious freedom that would result. However, when the text of the Constitution became known, Baptist leaders, including Pastor John Leland, expressed serious concerns because the document contained no guarantees for religious freedom. James Madison and others argued that these guarantees were unnecessary because the federal government could likely not attain a level of power that would threaten freedom of religion. However, Pastor Leland and many others insisted that their support for the Constitution was contingent on the addition of a Bill of Rights, and specifically one that addressed religious freedom. When Pastor Leland convinced Madison to offer the suggested amendments, Leland and other Baptist supporters ratified the Constitution and helped ensure its passage. All right, guys, I hope you have a great day. I'll see you later.